The Art and Science of Mead, Cleaning and Sanitation. Welcome to our series of educational videos dedicated to the craft of making mead. Cleaning and sanitation. This is a topic that many of us would really rather not talk about. It's tedious, it's a chore, it's something that's not as fun as talking about making and drinking mead, but it's something that's very important. I remember quite a few years back, I was at a party and someone made a comment. I brought beer to that party, and someone made a comment about how my beer tasted so good and clean, and it didn't have that homebrew taste that all homebrew beer has. And I was a bit confused. I didn't know what he was talking about. And he said, yeah, the taste, the homebrew taste, don't you know? And I was kind of confused, but later on he brought me some samples of his own homebrew, and his beer definitely had a taste. It was infected. He had dirty equipment and hadn't been taking precautions or care to keep his equipment clean. And so that was the, quote, taste that he was talking about, something that obviously we want to avoid. Sometimes new homebrewers and mead makers can get away with not being as diligent about cleaning and sanitation, at least at first, because their equipment is brand new and there's no biofilm on it. There's no film with microorganisms and dirt on it. But over time this builds up, and if it's not removed and if the equipment is not sanitized, it can develop infections that can result in off flavors and aromas, or that homebrew taste that one guy was talking about. And that's why it's essential for us to both clean and sanitize our equipment before and after every use, so that this doesn't happen. When we use the term infected, what we're talking about is having unwanted microorganisms. Wild yeast such as Brettanomyces and others, Lactobacillus and other bacteria. Most of these aren't harmful, and sometimes you might actually want them if you're trying to make a wild fermented or a sour fermented mead. But you don't want to have every single one of your batches to have these in it. And even though they're not harmful, they can result in flavors and aromas that make our mead not as good as it could be, or potentially even undrinkable. Occasionally I get asked this question: if the mead is infected, can it make me sick? Well, the yeast that we use for fermentation, Saccharomyces, has evolved to survive in high acid, high alcohol environment, basically rotting fruit. And as the alcohol levels increase, most of the other microorganisms that are present end up dying off, allowing the yeast that we use to continue to ferment and make alcohol and carbon dioxide. Pathogenic microorganisms typically can't survive in these high acid environments as the alcohol level increases. However, caution is advised. There are some situations where there could be a problem and that could cause you to be sick. There have been situations when prisoners attempted to make hooch, and they used what they had, like potatoes or something else, and basically it didn't ferment. And in an anaerobic, low-acid environment, botulism developed, and there have even been some deaths. And this also has happened among some homebrewers who tried to make a homebrew beer, and then they bottled this without it ever having fermented at all. And so this is something that should never happen if you fermented it, but if you didn't let it ferment, there could be risk of botulism. Other types of problems that could happen is if there were pre-existing pathogens such as Listeria or E. coli 157. It's been found in meat, dairy, fruit, unpasteurized apple juice or cider. So if you're using a fruit or fruit juice and it has these pathogens on it, and again, you don't allow alcoholic fermentation to occur, you could get in trouble with them. And then finally, if there were any toxins that were already pre-existing on the ingredients that you're using, obviously fermentation is not going to remove them or denature them. An important one is ochratoxin A, which is produced by moles and may be carcinogenic, and it's a problem in some parts of the world where grapes tend to get moldy, such as Italy or Mediterranean and other places. So if you're using fruit that is already molded or rotten, you could run into trouble with that, which is why you should always be using the best quality fresh fruit that you possibly can. Well, before we go any further, let's discuss some definitions. Cleaning is basically removing the soil or dirt from the surface of your equipment or whatever you were talking about. It could include cleaning of the facility itself. I mean, if you're a commercial meadery, you definitely want to keep the whole facility itself cleaned, so that includes the floor, the walls, and so on. Sanitizing is treatment of a previously cleaned surface to reduce the population of unwanted microorganisms to a level that's safe, so that when you put the mead into the equipment or through the equipment, it'll be safe and there won't be any spoilage. But sanitizing is not the same as disinfecting or sterilization. Those are more drastic reduction in number of microbial cells. Disinfecting would be something that you might think about being done in a lab or, say, in a hospital, where they're wiping or spraying down the surface so that any living cells are removed and destroyed. And then finally, sterilization. That's destruction of all cells, living cells as well as spores. That might be something that's done in an autoclave. Perhaps somebody's surgical equipment in a hospital will be put in autoclaves to be sterilized. But when we're talking about fermentation of alcoholic beverages, we don't need to talk about those latter two. We don't have to be completely sterile. We just need to be clean and sanitized. I see on some of the forums there are people using these terms interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same or interchangeable. That's why we need to be clear in what we're talking about. In general, there are 3 steps to cleaning and sanitation, and they may occur in different orders. For example, you may rinse first, then clean, then rinse, then sanitize. Cleaning is basically to remove the visible soil or residue from the equipment. It could be the dirt from fermentation. It could be pieces of fruit or yeast. Or you can also be wanting to remove some of the other things that can get onto your equipment as well. You always clean before you sanitize. Then sanitizing is basically to reduce or prevent the growth of microbial organisms, but again, it's not the same as complete sterilization. And then finally, rinsing is how you remove the residue of the cleaning and sanitizing agents as well as the microorganisms. And again, not to reiterate, but you always clean first and then you sanitize. If you try to sanitize without cleaning, most of these products simply won't be effective. Well, how do cleaning agents work? Well, first, the agent itself must be in close contact with the dirt or film that you're planning on removing, which is why most of these detergent agents have a surfactant. These are wetting agents, so that the cleaning agent can be in contact with it, whatever it is that you're trying to remove. Then the dirt is removed from the surface by breaking down proteins and fats, dissolving sugars and minerals. The dirt must be held in solution or suspension, because if it isn't, it just simply goes back onto your equipment, which is not what you want. And that's why it's ideal for these agents to have the ability to break down the dirt into smaller particles. We call that deflocculation. And then finally, you rinse to remove the soil as well as any residue of that cleaning agent from your equipment before you move on to sanitizing. Now, there are several factors to consider. Temperature is an important one, especially with cleaning agents. Warm or hot water improves the effectiveness of many cleaning agents, whereas many sanitizing agents might not need to be in hot water. Cool or warm water may be acceptable. It's always important to read what the manufacturer says on how you should prepare and use these types of agents. Scrubbing, of course. If you see any dirt or residue on your equipment, then it should be scrubbed physically to remove it. Be careful to use the appropriate type of scrubbing equipment. For example, you're not going to want to use, like a metal stainless steel wool on plastic. You'll scratch it, and there will always be dirt within those scratches. So make sure whatever you're using to scrub, whatever brush or other tool you're using to scrub, is something that's safe and won't damage the equipment that you're using. Time. Well, the longer the amount of time in contact the agent has with your equipment that's being cleaned or sanitized, the more effective it is. But there is a limit, and allowing too long of a use can potentially damage your equipment. So again, always follow the manufacturer's recommendations on how to use these products. Concentration. If the concentration is too dilute and not as is recommended, it may not be effective, but you can also have too much of a good thing. If it's too concentrated, besides wasting money, some of these agents could potentially damage your equipment. So it's very important to follow the recommendations for how these should be made up. And then finally, pH. Cleaning agents, most of them tend to be alkaline-based, while many of the sanitizing agents tend to be acid-based. And if the pH is too high for some of these acid-based sanitizing agents, they simply may not work. So in general, the process of cleaning and sanitation involves first pre-rinsing and scrubbing any visible dirt or residue, then using the cleaning agent, rinsing it to remove it. Some people put a citric acid to acidify the rinse, especially if you're using a strongly alkaline caustic cleaning agent, while the rest of us might simply use plain water for that. And then the use of a sanitizing agent, finally followed by a final rinse for some of them. Not all sanitizing agents require a final rinse, so it's always important to read and follow the directions for use. But in general, this is the process of cleaning and sanitation. As home mead makers, we have several options available for cleaning and sanitizing. Now, I'm not recommending any one of these over the other. There's certain ones that I prefer and I generally tend to use myself, but these all can be effective when they're used appropriately. One product that I find very effective is PBW, Powdered Brewery Wash. It's an alkaline cleaner made of sodium percarbonate and sodium metasilicate. It is safer than some of the more hazardous caustic alkaline chemicals used in commercial wineries. It's effective in hard water and at all temperatures. It does not corrode soft metals, and it works best when it's mixed in warm water and used for up to 30 minutes, or you can do a 24-hour cold soak overnight if you have particularly dirty equipment. There are other percarbonate-based cleaners available. They can be useful for removing labels. There are some of them that are labeled to be used in barrels, but be very careful and make sure, because not all of these are. Some labels suggest they may be used as both a cleaner and a sanitizer, but that's not recommended. It's better to use an agent that is a dedicated cleaner for cleaning, and then another agent that's a dedicated sanitizer for sanitizing. These agents don't dissolve that well in cold water, and they're thought not to be quite as potent as PBW. I generally agree with that, but if I didn't have any PBW available on hand, I would have no problem using any of these as my cleaning agent. Now moving over into the sanitizers. Star San is an acid-based sanitizer made of phosphoric acid and dodecyclobenzene sulfonic acid. It works very quickly. It has high foaming, and that is thought to be beneficial because it allows it to get into all the crevices and cracks. It needs to be used with a relatively acidic solution, so potentially if you have very hard water, this might be a problem. It's safe on the skin, although to be honest, if I got any of it on my skin, I would rinse it away, as soon as I was able to. It's recommended to not be used on soft metals. If you do, you should need to rinse it right away, even though it's supposedly does not need to be rinsed afterwards. It's in the situation where if I had to use it on metal, I would rinse it. A lot of the times the foam concerns, I see this on some of the forums where the mead makers are worried about leaving the foam in there, but that's part of how this agent works. So don't be afraid of the foam. A related acid-based sanitizer is Saniclean. It's basically a low foaming version of Star San. So it might be a good choice if you don't want foam, such as you're pumping a solution through the equipment or your lines. It's thought to be slightly less effective. You need to use about twice as much, and also slightly slower acting, so you might need to treat for twice as long. It also is recommended to not be used on soft metals, or if you do, make sure you rinse it immediately. This is because potentially you could have pitting of the metal. Iodine-based sanitizers have been used in the dairy industry frequently and can also work very well when we're home brewing and mead making. The downside is they can stain your plastic tubing and plastic parts, which is, not a problem. It's simply cosmetic, and it can also stain your skin if you get it on your hands. According to the manufacturer, rinsing is not required, but whenever I use iodine-based sanitizers, I do rinse, just because of you could get some flavor in there. We all know what the iodine smells like, so it's something that I would rinse these off. Bleach has been recommended in many homebrewing books for years, and I have to admit, when I first started out, that's what I used also. But now that we have some better options available, I would really try to stay away from bleach. It has to be rinsed very well, and it can be a serious problem in trichloroanisole, or also known as cork taint. If you are not familiar with that, it basically is like a musty root cellar. Commercial wineries years ago had significant problems with TCA, and it wasn't even just in the corks, but it was because they were using chlorine-based cleaners on their equipment and also even within the environment of their winery. And because it's volatile gas, the chlorine would get into other things such as the wall, wooden pallets, the barrels, cardboard, and it would contaminate the wine with the cork taint even without it being from the corks themselves. And although it is very effective, because of that potential risk of cork taint, I really try to stay away from bleach for my equipment, or even in the vicinity of where I make my mead. But if you need to use it because you have nothing else on hand, it does work well, and just make sure you rinse it very, very well. Well, then there's ethanol. And I'm not talking about the ethanol that we're planning on fermenting and eventually drinking. I'm talking about ethanol as a sanitizer. It's useful in airlocks or spraying onto surfaces that just can't be rinsed. Myself, I use cheap vodka. And you can also use it for storing some of the reusable filter cartridges. Although these are all situations where you could simply use an acidified sulfite solution just as easily. Acidified sulfite solution is very effective for sanitation. So we have sulfite around, of course, because we're using it as an antioxidant, antimicrobial agent to stabilize our mead. But in a high concentration solution, it can also be used for sanitizing. You add citric acid to the solution because the lower pH increases its effectiveness. Don't breathe in the fumes. If you ever have, you might be coughing and sputtering. Because it's a high acid solution, you really want to stay away from using it on metal, or if you do, rinse immediately after you use it. And as long as it has a strong sulfite aroma, smell type of thing, then it's probably still potent. If you keep it tightly sealed, a solution might last up to a year. I find I go through it fairly quickly. And you can use it for many things. You could use it for rinsing and cleaning your bottles prior to putting meat into them. But not just your carboys, lines, or other equipment. I also sometimes use this when I'm, say, using a wine thief to take some mead out of a barrel, and I splash a little bit on the outside of the barrel. Some of this in a spray bottle is really nice to spray right on the outside of the barrel and wherever the mead had gotten spilled. Now, many of us are meaderies in planning, and maybe some of you already are a commercial meadery. There are some options available for commercial mead makers that may not be available to home mead makers. And then some of the processes, although very similar, they are slightly different. The main one is the equipment is much larger. You can't take your 2,000-liter fermentation tank over to the sink and rinse it out, and so that's why you have to clean in place, CIP. The other thing is, because you're using a pump to circulate the cleaning solution, it's automated, and so you might be able to use some more potent agents for cleaning, some more caustic cleaners, but the downside, these can be potentially more hazardous, so you need to make sure you wear safety goggles, gloves. You definitely don't want to get some of these products on your skin. And the other thing too is, if you are a commercial mead maker and you're cleaning large-scale equipment, definitely make sure you understand safety, like in an enclosed equipment. There have been deaths in wineries from asphyxiation by going into a tank that maybe wasn't fully empty of wine, or was empty but no fresh air got in there, and simply was asphyxiation from carbon dioxide. So definitely make sure you understand how to be safe among equipment like that to avoid a tragedy. And then the final thing that you're going to have to think about if you're a metering and planning is wastewater disposal. You can't just put this stuff down the drain. If you're going to be, say, in a city or a town, there's going to be some rules about what you can do, especially some of the more caustic cleaners that you use. They need to be addressed so that they're neutral prior to putting them down the drain. Otherwise, you'll get in a lot of trouble. And then also, let's say you're planning on building, a residential leach field simply will not have the capacity to handle the wastewater amounts that you might use if you have a metery, anything that's larger than a small home metery. So that's also something that you keep in mind when you're designing your metery. And that discussion is really far beyond and outside the scope of this presentation. But I'm mentioning it for those of you that are thinking about becoming commercial, just so that you're aware of it, something to think about. And anyway, some of the options available for commercial meteries that we don't generally use as home mead makers include some of the caustic cleaners, the quat agents, peracetic acid, ozone, as well as very hot water, much hotter than you can get out of your tap or steam. So the alkaline-based cleaners, some of them are actually the more mild alkali, are very similar to some of the ones that we use as home mead makers, but there's also more strong alkali, including sodium hydroxide and potassium hydroxide. At high concentrations, they're antimicrobial, and they can be used when you have a very high level of soil or dirt to be removed. But they're potentially dangerous. I mean, if you get one of those into your eye, it could cause blindness. So that's why you need to be very, very careful in using them. And because they are so alkali, you typically will finish, after you clean your equipment with these, you'll finish, or you'll rinse with a citric acid solution, water solution, to neutralize any of the alkali cleaner that's left on your equipment. Quaternary ammonium compounds, or quat agents, are sanitizers, and they work by damaging the cell membranes of microorganisms. They're more effective at killing living yeast and mold, and less effective at killing bacterial or fungal spores. They don't really leave any negative aroma or flavor. They're low toxicity, and they're not corrosive, say, to metal. One benefit is they have prolonged activity, so after cleaning you can just leave it on the equipment that's not going to be used immediately, and then just make sure you rinse it before you use that equipment. They're most effective at extremely hot temperatures, but they can be neutralized if you have very hot hard water. So if your tap water or well water is very hard, then these agents might not be as effective. If there's a high dirt load, they're not as effective, but again, this is a sanitizing agent, so you'd always use a cleaning agent first, and then use the quat agent. And because they contain ammonium, that's a source of nitrogen, so if it's not rinsed before use, you could be adding a nitrogen source for some microorganisms, so that might be something that's not wanted. And that brings us to peracetic acid, which is an acid-based as well as oxidizing sanitizing agent. It has very strong antimicrobial activity. It oxidizes the cell membranes of bacteria, yeast, mold, and also spores. It works fairly quickly, but is more expensive than some of the other options available to commercial meteries. It technically, when used at the levels recommended by the manufacturer, many of these products do not require rinsing. Then there's ozone. This is something that's used commonly in the food industry. It's basically a gas that's made from an oxygen molecule. It's O3 rather than the regular oxygen, O2. And because it's such a strong oxidizer, it's very effective at killing microbes. The downside is it's unstable and decomposes quickly, so you can't store it. You have to generate it on site using a special ozone producing equipment. But that's also a benefit too, because there's not any residue. It basically goes away fairly quickly, so you don't need to do like a final rinse or anything like that. So the next method of sanitizing for commercial meteries is hot water or steam. Now this is water much hotter than what you can get out of the tap at home. It works by denaturing enzymes and proteins, and thus sanitizing and killing microorganisms. The effect is dependent on how hot the water is, and then also how long you leave it on. A common method is 180 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. It does require special equipment to produce such hot water or steam, and obviously producing this might have some energy costs involved. Hot water or steam is not only for cleaning equipment, but also something that the commercial meterer might think about in cleaning the premise itself. The floors and the drains and the walls and even the ceilings. I remember some years ago I was doing a tour of a winery, and I looked down in the drain, and there were fruit flies flying around when we first went into the back, which is always not a good sign. Some winemakers nickname those vinegar flies because they're flying around carrying all kinds of acetic acid producing bacteria waiting to try to get into the wine itself and then cause all number of unwanted infection. I looked down into the drain and I saw several inches of I don't know what covered with mold. Now, it wasn't like they had just done their fruit press that day and they hadn't gotten around to cleaning their drains. This stuff had been there probably for months and months, and somebody needed to really take those covers off and scoop that out and then wash it all down with very hot water, but they obviously didn't bother to do that. I tried to be optimistic about what the quality of the wine would be when we did our wine tasting afterwards, but it was pretty clear in the wine there was a volatile acidity and all kinds of off flavors. If they were not careful about being clean and taking precautions about the things you can see, like looking down in their drains, I could only wonder what about all the other things that we can't see, like their standard process for cleaning their equipment, and it definitely showed in their product. So that's something very important for commercial meterers to think about too. It's not just the equipment, but also the entire premise itself of where you're producing. You're going to be producing your mead. Barrels are a very special situation because they're porous. They're not like stainless steel or glass or even some of the plastic type of vessels that. So they're unique among our fermentation and storage vessels. They also are intended to provide oak character and tannins, and so if you clean too aggressively, you can deplete the oak and tannins and potentially shorten the useful life. Every time you use an oak barrel for aging mead, there's less oak and tannins, and eventually you'll have what they call a neutral barrel, to where you can use it for storing, and it's great for micro-oxygenation, but it doesn't really add any oak character or flavor. And if you use aggressive cleaning agents, you can deplete that sooner than would have happened otherwise. Because oak is permeable, they're more challenging to sanitize, and they're more likely to get infected. And honestly, if it's infected with something that you don't want, for example, Brettanomyces, those barrels probably, need to basically be retired or made into, use it as a display in your tasting room in a commercial meadery, or if you're a home mead maker, put it in your wherever in your house you drink your mead, or have it cut in half and use it as a planter or whatever. Barrels, because they're porous, can develop cork taint, TCA, so that's why you must always avoid any type of chlorine or bleach type of cleaning agent. From a practical consideration, there's only a small bunghole for access, so you can't reach down there with a brush and easily scrub it, and you can use a power washer or a sprayer to try to get in there, but otherwise you can't really scrub the walls the way that you could easily reach down into, say, a stainless steel tank. And used barrels, you need to handle them and prepare them for long-term storage. So because they can develop mold inside or they can dry out. Ideally, you should always just store them full of mead. If you're planning on racking out the mead and then refilling it with more mead immediately, then you basically just need to rinse thoroughly with water and rinse with an acid wash made up of citric acid. Some folks use a citric acid sulfite cleaning in this. You don't have to do that if you're planning on refilling it. And there's no reason to suspect that this barrel is infected or anything like that. And then after you wash it out with the acid wash, then you basically refill it with more mead. But if you're going to store your barrel empty for any length of time, or if your barrel is very, very dirty, then you might need to use additional steps to clean. And for more aggressive cleaning of barrel, you can use sodium percarbonate, And this is an agent that, when it's dissolved into water, it becomes sodium carbonate and also hydrogen peroxide. So for cleaning, it can, you can dissolve it in cold or warm water, and some of these agents don't dissolve very quickly, so make sure it's fully dissolved before you put it into your barrel. It can be helpful if you have some spoilage microorganisms, but only to some extent. Maybe if you've got some malolactic bacteria in there that you want to suppress, but you're not going to completely sterilize it. So if a barrel is truly infected with a microbial organism that you don't want, there's not any way you're going to completely sanitize it, and you're probably going to have to consider retiring that barrel, or only use it for adding that additional microbial character. If you want it, if it's a malolactic barrel, then you just use it for malolactic fermentations for the rest of its life. Sodium percarbonate can remove excess tannins. That might be good if it's a brand new barrel that's very tannic. The longer you soak it, the more tannin will be removed. Myself, I prefer to manage that by simply having the first mead that goes into a brand new barrel be in there the shortest, to taste it, and once it's tannic enough, I take it out and put in another one after that. If I accidentally left it in too long and that mead is too tannic, I just use it for blending with later batches that I might age in that barrel later on that are not getting as much of that oak or tannin character. You need to store the powder in a sealed container, because the hydrogen peroxide, when in contact with air and humidity in the air, can break down quickly. And then you must always follow the barrel washing with the sodium percarbonate with a citric acid solution to deactivate it. I tend not to do this. I tend not to need to do this, but this is something, if you've got a dirty barrel or one that you want to clean out very well for storing long term, you may want to use this prior to preparing for barrel storage. And like I said, ideally a barrel should be stored full of mead or wine, but sometimes you just don't have a batch ready to put into a barrel, so you have to store the barrel temporarily. So after cleaning and rinsing well, you have two options. If you're going to store it short term, so just for a few weeks, less than a couple of months, you can store it wet with what some call a mock wine solution of sulfite and citric acid. So for about every liter of fluid that you're going to put into that barrel, you have 1 gram of citric acid and 2 grams of potassium metabisulfite. The downside of this technique is it will deplete tannins in oak. I mean, it's going to come out of the solution the same as if you had mead in there. So you don't want to really do this for the long term. This is a temporary solution. The nice thing about it, though, is that it does prevent the barrel from drying out, because it has a solution within it. For longer term solution, or storage, you want to store it dry. Now, it might not be bone dry. There might still be some moisture inside the barrel. Some of the commercial wineries can actually put sulfite gas directly into that, but that's something that a home mead maker is not going to be able to do, and I suspect that most commercial mead makers are not able to do either. And a traditional technique is to burn a sulfite wick in the barrel. It's important to not let the sulfite drip into the barrel, because you can have a problem with excess sulfites. The sulfite gas from the burned wick will eventually dissipate, so you might need to repeat it as frequently as every 3 to 5 weeks, which can be a real pain in the neck, which is another reason why it's best to make sure you have another batch of mead on hand to put into the used barrel, so that you don't have to worry about things like that. Well, that finally brings us to the conclusion of cleaning and sanitation. Just to review, typically there's a pre-rinse with warm or hot water, as well as scrubbing. At the minimum, if I'm very busy and I can't go through my cleaning and sanitizing process, at the very minimum, I rinse my equipment with water. The last thing you want to do is to empty it, not rinse off any of the gunk, the fruit, the yeast, whatever else is on there, and then let that film dry on, because then it's going to be much more difficult to remove. So at the very minimum, I will rinse any visible dirt and scrub it off with water, seal it up so it doesn't dry out, and then come back knowing that, okay, I do need to finish the cleaning and sanitizing process. That's not ideal, though. I mean, ideally you want to do your pre-rinse scrubbing, use your cleaning agent, rinse off that cleaning agent, then use your sanitizing agent, and then if necessary, depending on what the sanitizing agent, then rinse that off, so that you're good to go the next time. You don't have to worry about any of the residual drying and getting stuck on the inside of your equipment. And then finally, after you've cleaned and sanitized your equipment, it's good to take a look at it. Does it look clean? Does it smell clean? Does it feel clean? Sometimes you can feel rough spots, which are actually dirt that you really can't see very well, that needs to be scrubbed off better. And did every part of equipment which had contact with Mead get exposed to your cleaning and sanitizing agent? And finally, that brings us to what is my personal preferred method of cleaning and sanitizing? Well, as I kind of mentioned, first I rinse and scrub off any obvious visible dirt or film using warm or hot water. Be careful, of course, with your glass carboys. They can crack. If you get one that's been sitting outside, in the winter ice cold, and then you put some hot water in it, you're going to basically make it crack on you. So make sure that you don't use excessively hot water, so that you don't crack your glass equipment. Next, I like to use an alkaline cleaner, typically a PBW, in hot water. Again, not excessively hot. You don't want to crack your glass carboy. Then I'll rinse, and if I missed any areas, if there's any dirt that I didn't get with my initial scrubbing or the PBW didn't get, then I'll scrub off those if I can see anything. And then I follow with an acid-based sanitizer. And typically it's going to be Star San or Saniclean, or sometimes I'll use a homemade acidified sulfite solution. I don't really have a preference among any of these. They all tend to work. It's probably what I reach for first or what I happen to have on hand. But one of the things I do try to avoid, if possible, is bleach. Even though I used bleach many times for many years because that's all I had and all I knew, it's something that I really wouldn't be using now if I had any choice to use anything else. Now, most of these references that I used are easily available, open access online. As with all of my presentations, I strongly encourage you to read up on your own if you have any questions. Don't take my word for it or anybody else's word for it, but learn on your own. You might come up with your own process that seems to work for you and make the most sense for you, and it might not be exactly the same as I or any other mead maker may use. But as long as it works for you and your equipment is clean and sanitized, then that's what you need to do. Well, thank you for watching this presentation. Again, cleaning and sanitation is something that, it's not as fun to talk about as, honey varietals or selecting the best yeast for that honey or fruit combination. But you don't want to be like that guy that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation where all your batches eventually develop this, quote, homebrew taste simply because your equipment is dirty and infected.